All right. Thank you for coming to watch me and not be watching the football. Last time I checked that Brentford were beating Wolves. I'm sorry if you were, holding out for match of the day. So my talk today is going to be on the Communist Party of Great Britain and anti-racist politics in the post-war era. And it's based on my book, British Communism and the Politics of Race, which was then also based on my PhD that I did on the Communist Party and its evolution from anti-fascist, anti-imperialist organisation in the 1930s and 40s through to the demise of the party in the 1980s. So let's go. So one of the questions that gets asked is why focus on the Communist Party's anti-racism? That it was a relatively small political party, and why is it important? So, despite its relatively small size, the Communist Party is very important in the history of anti-racism in Britain. It is one of the first political parties that has kind of roots in the labour movement, and it has a kind of a large white membership that had an anti-colonial program. So from the very beginning, it was internationalist in its outlook, and it had a kind of an explicit anti-colonial, anti-imperialist program. One of the conditions of joining the Third International, which the Communist Party of Great Britain does in the 1920s, is that kind of anti-imperialist solidarity, working as an anti-imperialist force, particularly the Communist Party in Britain, because it's at the metropole, it's at the heart of empire. It was given a special task by Moscow to work as a coordinating centre for anti-colonialists and for socialists across the British Empire. Also very important is the Communist Party had this legacy of anti-fascism that had built up during the 30s and the 40s. We all know the kind of the Battle of Cable Street and the fights against Mosley in the 30s, and then also it's part of the 43 group in the late 1940s against the union movement. And I think that the period that I look at in my book is one of the first groups within the British labour movement to defend migrant rights in the post-war period, and it was actively campaigning for against racial discrimination in that post-war period, particularly in the 40s and 50s, when there's first large-scale migration from the Commonwealth, and that it's fighting to against any kind of colour bar. So I think that's why it's important, and that the Communist Party, although its kind of influence fades in the 70s and 80s, is very important from that period, particularly from the 20s to the 70s. It's a very important organisation for understanding anti-colonialism and anti-racism in Britain. So firstly, I'll just talk a little bit about the Communist International. So the Communist International set up that part of its conditions was this anti-colonialism, this anti-imperialism, based on the kind of view that workers in the West could not be liberated if the people in the developing world, in the colonies at this stage, were not also free. Particularly the Communist Party, that based in at the heart of empire, was instructed to be very important, and that it was supposed to coordinate between anti-colonialists across the British Empire. The focus of the party's anti-colonialism was in India. So we have like Parmadat, Shapoorji Saklatvala, and Benjamin Bradley as kind of these well-known Communist Party figures who are involved in anti-colonialism, working with Indian anti-colonialists working with the independence movement. Saklavala was, he was a joint Labour and Communist MP and was very vocal in Britain about, Indian independence. Benjamin Bradley, who goes out to India in the late 1920s and becomes part of the Meerut trial in the late 1920s and early 1930s. That India, because it is probably the most pronounced anti-imperial movement of the interwar period, is kind of the focus of anti-colonialism and Britain and the Communist Party. And that's what they dedicate a lot of their attention to when they're dedicating attention to anti-colonial matters. That the Communist Party is very much involved in the kind of Comintern initiatives like the League Against Imperialism, which is set up in the late 1920s. In the third period, so that period of class against class, is also the period where there is a much more emphasis by the Communist International on anti-colonialism. So that period from about 1928, 1929 through to 34, 35. And the Communist Party is heavily involved in that. In the Popular Front period, which follows, 35 through to the end of the war, bar that kind of 39 to 41 period, is that that there is an argument made by some scholars, so people like Neil Redfern and Marika Sherwood and Christian Hogsberg. They argue that that the anti-colonialism of the Communist Party kind of wanes in the Popular Front period because they're kind of allying with the national bourgeoisie against fascism. But I think, as John Callaghan said in kind of rebuttal to Marika Sherwood at the time in the debate in Science and Society, is that for a party that was as small as the Communist Party was, even during the Popular Front period, it was very kind of very vocal about anti-colonial issues. And this anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism shapes how the Communist Party reacts to migrants coming from the Commonwealth and how it approaches issues of race and immigration in the post-war period. So large-scale migration from the Commonwealth starts to occur in the late 1940s, originally from the Caribbean. There's the Windrush is in June 1948, and that we know that period from 48 to 62 when the immigration controls come in as the Windrush generation. And so it's originally from the Caribbean and West Africa eventually, that there are more people come from South Asia also, as well as from places like Cyprus and also other places in the British Empire or Commonwealth by this stage, and that a lot of them are coming in to fill the labour shortages that Britain faced after the war, and they're being pushed into they're being recruited into these industries, into textiles, into mining, into the dock work, etc. And the Communist Party, with its influence in the trade union movement, is very kind of interesting because it is vocal against a colour bar. So they talk about the discrimination being faced by migrant workers, that they argue against the colour bar. That the colour bar that had existed in the empire that they argue was being replicated in Britain. And they argue against this. So they're very, so when they approach issues of race and immigration in Britain, they're looking at through a colonial and anti-colonial lens. They argue that these people coming here, they're coming from empire, and that kind of racial hierarchy that exists in empire is being replicated in Britain, and they argue that this shouldn't be done, and they try to argue within the trade unions that the trade unions should be at the forefront of fighting for against racial discrimination, for the rights and for better treatment of migrant workers in Britain. So you see that the picture here is of Brothers in the Fight for a Better Life, which was produced by the London District Committee of the Communist Party in the mid-1950s, and shows that very much the kind of the position of the party at that stage. That before immigration controls come in 1962, so there's no real controls against Commonwealth migration up until the 1960s, and before immigration controls come in, the Communist Party is very kind of vocal against any controls for immigrants from the Commonwealth. That this is something that the TUC, so the TUC is much more kind of wavering or muddled on this issue, as well as the Labour Party itself. But the Communist Party is kind of dead fast against any kind of controls up until the controls are introduced in 1962. They have a slightly different position once controls come in. So there's really kind of two prongs to their fight from the 50s onwards. It's really about fighting racial discrimination in Britain and fighting against immigration controls. Now, because the Communist Party viewed migrants as kind of part as an extension of their anti-imperial work and anti-colonial work, is that a lot of the issues that they deal with concerning migrant workers was dealt with by the international department. So when if people arrived, they possibly had been members of parties, similar parties in the empire, or had been or were working in trade unions in the empire and then came to Britain, that they were kind of handled by the international department. In the 50s, that they kind of create these things called nationality branches, where there's an Indian branch, a Cypriot branch, a West Indian branch, and these branches act as kind of like it's separate from the kind of the geographic branches that are around the country. That these branches, particularly handled by the London District Committee, where they kind of organise members who are, West Indian or from India or Cyprus and so forth, and while that means that they're concentrating a lot on those issues and those branches, there is a kind of a criticism that there is kind of a hiving off. There's a distinction between ordinary white members and kind of people of color who are then part of the party, but which are kept separate. And that is something which comes up, is that, how much does the party's anti-racist work, which is very important, factor into their kind of bread and butter work? So one aspect of this, as we can see also, is their involvement in the movement for colonial freedom, which eventually becomes liberation. So the movement for colonial freedom was started by Fenner Brockway in the mid-1950s, part of the Labour Party. He is one of the people who is pushing in the 1950s up until 1965 for some kind of legislation for against racial discrimination, and he's also kind of very vocal about colonial freedom. And this very early on gets endorsement from the Communist Party. And members of the Communist Party's international department are heavily involved in movement for colonial freedom all the way throughout its existence. People like Kay Beecham, Tony Gilbert, Jack Wattis, they're all involved in the movement for colonial freedom and then liberation. And this is kind of the Communist Party's involvement also sees when the movement for colonial freedom changes into liberation, moving from kind of like a strict kind of anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist agenda in the 50s and 60s through to the 1970s, when it becomes involved in anti-racism and anti-fascism. So Liberation in 1974, they are the organisers of the Anti-National Front March and led Red Lion Square, which is very controversial because a protester is killed, and Tony Gilbert, who was a Communist Party member, writes the book Only One Died, about the aftermath of the Red Lion Square. So they're very much involved, and this is something that also Brockway by the 60s and 70s is kind of antagonized with, is he kind of doesn't want the Communist Party to be so heavily involved. So the picture here I have is that that Tony Gilbert and Kay Beecham both wrote pamphlets for Liberation on anti-racist issues and anti-colonial issues, but they very much read like Communist Party pamphlets. You would be hard pressed to see a difference between if that publication was made by the Communist Party and then by Liberation. So the movement for colonial freedom is a kind of important organizing platform for the international department, and the kind of way that they kind of build anti-colonial and anti-racist work. But that's not the only kind of anti-racist and anti-imperialist campaign organization that Communist Party members are involved in. That the Communist Party is important in the anti-racist movement in Britain because it is at the beginning of so many of them. So things like the anti-apartheid movement that begins in the late 1950s is very much a cooperation between Communist Party of Great Britain members, exiled people from the South African Communist Party, people from the ANC, from the African National Congress who are in London, and the Communist Party is heavily involved in the early stages of setting up what became the anti-apartheid movement. Also other ones like the Chilean Solidarity Campaign, the Indian Workers Association. Now the Indian Workers Association splits into several, but Vishnu Sharma, who is a Communist Party member, he is very instrumental in the IWA in Southall. Also later on things like the Campaign Against Racist Laws, and as well as the British Council for Peace in Vietnam, although that is kind of overtaken by the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, which is more led by the Trotskyist groups. But the Communist Party eventually kind of like views the VSC as kind of an important anti-imperialist organization. So this is part of the party's kind of broad popular alliances. It's about building in quotation marks, a mass party, and it's working with people in other movements. This is something that started from the British Road to Socialism, saying that the Communist Party needs to work with the trade unions and the Labour Party to implement some kind of a democratic path to socialism. And in the 60s and in the 60s and in the 70s, they heavily emphasize this. And we can see that kind of that is working with these kind of campaign groups. A lot of the time, the Communist Party is working as individuals rather than as a kind of a communist bloc. Like the movement for colonial freedom liberation is kind of like an odd one out in that regard, and particularly as you go on into the 70s, that this becomes more the case. So they're working as individuals and not as a kind of a coherent bloc. But there is often a synergy between the Communist Party line and the line in some of these campaigns, particularly because more broadly they become aligned with kind of pro-Moscow, pro-Soviet Union politics, which is something you can see with the anti-apartheid movement. The anti-apartheid movement is obviously connected to the SACP and the ANC, which are kind of aligned with Moscow. And then that kind of, because the Communist Party is also aligned. But the Communist Party, has members in all these other organizations. So you see the same names popping up again and again as members on committees and so forth. But the Communist Party is not the only game in town. So just bringing up that point again about the British road to socialism is that the Communist Party had these kind of, through the British road to socialism, it was fostering links through the labour movement. They saw the trade unions as very important because if the Communist Party can influence the trade unions, then that can influence the Labour Party, and they want to build this kind of Labour Party communist alliance. But one of the things that you see in the history of anti-racism in Britain is the trade unions are lagging behind on anti-racism. And the Communist Party, because they put so much effort into trade union work, is that this is what Trevor Carter calls the kind of like a division between anti-racism and the bread and butter issues. So Trevor Carter, who was a Communist Party, West Indian Communist Party member, it says that often that kind of the everyday struggles of trade unionism, particularly in that period between 66 and 74, is very much about wage militancy, defending of trade union rights, and then the kind of anti-racist work that can be done with trade unions falls behind. So the Communist Party has this balancing act where it wants to influence the trade unions on anti-racism, but then has these other competing forces, and it is really surpassed by more radical groups in the 60s and 70s. So on one competitor was Black Power groups and other forms of activism by people of color, by migrants, who very much kind of like wanted not to be led by the white left. So we see in 1970, like the 69-70, the British Black Panther Party, and other kind of similar groups around in the early 70s. And then also there's the Trotskyist and Maoist groups who kind of push a more militant anti-racism and anti-fascism. So the competitors for the Communist Party are the International Marxist Group, the International Socialists, which eventually become the Socialist Workers' Party, and then that, and they're kind of really the larger groups on the left, which are also doing kind of anti-racist work. I mean, there's also the Socialist Labour League, which becomes the Workers' Revolutionary Party and militant, but I think that they're not doing as much in the anti-racist sphere and in an anti-fascist sphere as the IMG and IS, who are the kind of the real main competitors. Particularly when we look at the anti-fascist movement in the 70s, it's really the Trotskyists. I do mention Maoism now, so the Maoist groups really had the most influence through things like the Indian Workers Associations. So after the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s, the Indian Workers Association splits also, and the ones that follow the Chinese line I believe it's Avtar Jahul, they become kind of very kind of anti-racist, militant anti-racist. There's also the smaller groups like the Communist Party of England, Marxist-Leninists, who denounce everyone as fascist. And I could talk more about them in question time if you want. So I think that the crux moment is in the 70s with the anti-fascist movement and the rise of the National Front and the Communist Party, that Dave Renton and James Eden says that by the 70s the Communist Party has missed the boat on anti-fascism and it's been overtaken by other forces. And this is a kind of a particular sticking point because the Communist Party has been so quite central to anti-fascism in the 30s and the 40s. So one thing is that it had the legacy of the Battle of Cable Street and kind of other big events like the Battle of Olympia in 1934 and that kind of thing. And the Communist Party really plays on that in its anti-racist work and its anti-fascist work, is it points to, we have been challenging racism and fascism since the 30s, so the sort of, but then groups like the IS/SWP in the 1970s saying, like, we are taking up the mantle of the Communist Party's anti-fascism in the 1930s. The Communist Party of today is nowhere near as kind of brave as it was back then. And then also in the post-war period, as I mentioned before, that the Communist Party members had been involved in the 43 group, which were kind of Jewish militant anti-fascists that mobilized against the union movement in the late 1940s, which we're now knowing more about. There's been several histories written about them since the 1990s, and understand that kind of there was a kind of a synergy between the Jewish anti-fascists and the communist anti-fascists in the 43 group. But it really, that dips off. Then when Enoch Powell comes along and the National Front come along in the 60s and 70s, the Communist Party is seen as doing too little too late. I think that's what an IS flyer during the original strikes involving Enoch Powell. So there's, Enoch Powell gives his Rivers of Blood speech in April 1968, and then some workers come out in favor of Powell and protest the Smithfield meat workers, and then there's other workers that are kind of anti-Powell, and the Communist Party is seen as doing too little to kind of encourage kind of this an anti-racism amongst these workers, and it allows other groups to try and kind of push a more radical agenda. In the 70s, with the rise of the National Front, there's kind of a more arguing for a confrontational approach. So both the Trotskyists and the Maoists at Red Lion Square. So Red Lion Square is going to be this big demonstration by a meeting by the National Front and the various groups. So like the International Marxist Group, the International Socialists, the Communist Party of England, Marxist-Leninists, all kind of like want to kind of not let the National Front in, the clash with the police, while the Communist Party, through liberation, are much more holding back, and they denounce after kind of a mini riot breaks out, that the Communist Party criticize the kind of Trotskyists and the Maoists as adventurist. This happens again when the National Front try to march through Lewisham in 1977 on a campaign for kind of anti-mugging campaign. Lewisham is an area with a large kind of Afro-Caribbean community. The Communist Party, through Al-Kharaf, so that's the All London Campaign Against Racism and Fascism, they organise a march and a demonstration that's happening away from the National Front march, while the Socialist Workers' Party and kind of other anti-fascists organise a demonstration much closer, and this results again in kind of confrontation between the police and anti-fascists, as well as some National Front members. And there is a debate in the various presses afterwards. Is that the Communist Party denounced the SWP as adventurist, while the SWP calls the Communist Party reformist. And there's kind of like this dual approach. The Communist Party is trying to kind of gain a kind of a mass anti-racist awareness, bringing in various community groups, bringing in the trade unions, bringing in the Labour Party, while the Trotskyists are saying that not much is being done, that you need to confront fascism head on. Eventually, the Anti-Nazi League comes along, set up by the SWP and members of the Labour Party, and the Communist Party, because they're wary about the Trotskyist involvement, first of all, they're kind of standoffish, but it begins in 1977, by 1978 it gives it support. By this time, also, it's the time that what would become the Euro-communists, the kind of the people who are kind of wanting reform within the party, pushing the broad democratic alliance, and they see the Anti-Nazi League as kind of a way forward. So this comes to that all through the background of this is that there is a debate going on within the Communist Party about the way in which the British Road to Socialism and the Mass Party and its relationship between class and new social movements should interact. So in the period between 66 and 74, so the kind of the height of trade union militancy, the class traditionalists of the Communist Party are really in driving seat. They're arguing that that this is a time where the trade unions are taking on governments, taking on the Wilson government and the Heath government. They're quite, and the thing is quite successful. But when the social contract comes in 74, there's kind of like a reevaluation of like the Communist Party put a lot of effort into working with the trade unions, particularly the higher echelons of the trade unions. And what have they got? They feel kind of like that there's a push that this should have led to something more radical, but there's kind of like a disappointment with with the Labor government that comes in 74, and a disappointment that there was so much effort put into trade union politics while ignoring these kind of new emerging social movements like anti-racism, women's liberation, the peace movement, eventually gay rights in the late 70s and 80s, so forth. And there is a kind of like a push to reorientate the party towards a kind of a more kind of embrace of social movements and what we now know as identity politics. And one of those is anti-racism. So things like the Anti-Nazi League, which is a broad coalition, is seen as, and kind of heavily involved in kind of cultural politics through Rock Against Racism, is seen as the way forward. Like Stuart Hall in Marxism Today says it's one of the great cultural political movements that happened recently. And there's a revision of how the party sees race and immigration that prior to the 1970s, really it's run by the International Department. Then by the 1970s, we start to see kind of a push that there should be some form of reorganization of how race relations and issues of race are dealt with in the party. And in the late 70s, they create this National Race Relations Committee, which takes the kind of issue out of the hands of the International Department. Most of the people that join that are Euro-communists. The two people who are really writing for the party about issues of race, they published the pamphlets and the articles in Comment and Marxism Today. It's Kay Beecham and Joan Bellamy and Jocko Wattis, and those are all kind of like, they're people who you would characterize on the kind of traditionalist class side of things, while there's a new emergent group who are writing about race, who are more Euro-communist. So people like Dave Cook, who writes the pamphlet in 1978, A Knife at the Throat of Us All, Racism in the National Front. And there's people like Trevor Carter, Winston Pinder, Vishnu Sharma, who are more kind of aligned, more heavily with the Euro-communists. And my thesis, what my book argues, is that actually by the early 1980s, we see a greater nuance in the Communist Party's approach to anti-racism in that kind of 1980s period, but it's the same time as the party is falling apart. So membership goes into decline. It's been falling since the 1960s, but it takes on a more rapid element in the late 70s and into the 80s. And then there's the kind of overarching schisms between the traditionalists and the reformists, the Euros and the Tankies. And within this, while all that kind of stuff is going on, the kind of Marxism today versus the Morning Star, is that we actually see a greater nuance about the Communist Party's anti-racism, but as overshadowed by a declining party. So that Stuart Hall's writing in Marxism today, is really intelligent stuff, and we're still reading it today. And it kind of shows that the Communist Party had this kind of ideas, but because of the overarching conflict within the party, that it was really kind of unable to push through these kind of more this greater nuance, and it was overtaken then by other parties and other issues that it wasn't able to contend with. So that's really the end of my talk. I just that the Communist Party is important in the history of anti-racism in Britain and kind of anti-colonialism, because from the 1920s to the 1970s, it is kind of one of the primary political organizations which has ties to the labor movement, which pushes a consistent anti-colonial and then a consistent anti-racist message. It is overtaken by several competing factors in the 70s and 80s. So there's the kind of the more militant Trotskyists and the Maoists. There's kind of greater representation being called for by migrants and people of color. And which kind of overtake it on kind of like an anti-racist front, but then is also a victim of the kind of the war, and it's particularly its anti-racism is a victim of the changing political landscape of what happens in the 70s and 80s, and its eventual dissolution in 1991. But I think that you can't write a history of anti-racism in Britain without discussing the role that the important role that the Communist Party played between the 20s and the 70s, but then also it's worth mentioning how events overtook that initiative, and the party went in decline as a time when I think it was developing some really interesting ideas on anti-racism. And that's it, and I'll open it to questions. That was a very brief overview, so there's lots of things that I can discuss, so I encourage questions. So I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Evan. That was a really thorough summary of what's in your book, and for those that haven't read the book, I certainly would encourage you. It's published by